In this interview, I was privileged to be joined by John McGill. John runs a company called On Ice Rehab, and the purpose of John's company is to bridge the gap between hockey players and skaters who have been injured or in that bridge between returning from injury and returning to participation in the sport. He has a lot of great ideas and takes a very no nonsense approach to what he does. He's one of the few people who specializes in this niche, does a fantastic job, and just has some wonderful lessons to share on that period of return to sport after an injury. And he shares some great anecdotes and some great stories about some of the individuals he worked with. So I hope you enjoy this recording as much as I enjoyed making it.
So back in 2008, 2009, I was actually the strength and conditioning coach for the Lethbridge Hurricanes of the Western Hockey League. That's major junior here in Canada. And that year we had a kid go to the World Junior Championship where he suffered a high ankle sprain. And so when he came back, the traditional off-ice processes started with the rehab and in the training room, and then what I could do with him from a strength and conditioning perspective. And he was medically cleared to go back and skate. And I went and watched him when he stepped back on the ice, and you could tell right away that there was something not quite proper that was happening with him on the ice. So at that time, we didn't consider how equipment or ice surface or loading would affect somebody coming back from an injury. It just didn't cross our minds. But it was at that time, that specific moment, that I realized there was a gap between our traditional off-ice rehab processes and the return to play. So once he stepped back on ice, he was basically on his own. So Zach was put back in, and he played, and sure enough, he tweaked it, and he was done for another 6 weeks. So it was at that time that, in identifying that gap, that I went and talked to the coach and to the general manager, and I said, listen, this is what I'd like to do. And that was basically the birth of what I've been doing for the last 15 years. So from that, I developed and researched and developed what I call the interval sports injury recovery process for hockey. And kids play soccer, they play football, and baseball especially have been using interval processes for years to return players from injury. Hockey in Canada is still very antiquated. It's not that long ago. The idea was to just rub some dirt on it and get back out there. But this process that I developed, I did it with our player, and we spent time on ice where we did recovery work. We didn't do rehab. We did recovery work to return his function, sport specifically, in equipment, on ice, dealing with all the nuances of the game and of the sport. And he made a full recovery with zero recurrence, and he's still playing today in Europe. So that was essentially the birth of what I do now and have been doing for the last 15 years.
That was your aha moment, as it were. I think we all have one of those from time to time in work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the interval based term that you were using?
So the ISURF, or interval sport injury recovery process for hockey, I'll just keep it with ISURF because that's a mouthful. There isn't a formula. I have a process, and the reason there isn't a formula is because every athlete is different. Every athlete is different mentally, psychologically, how much they can handle pain, what they're willing to do at the start. So the process is built. And one thing I'll say for your viewers is that I'm not a medical professional. I'm technically a strength and conditioning and a skating coach. And so what I do is I take the injury and I research it and I understand how everything moves, the biomechanics of it. And then I build a program of skating exercises to reintroduce that injury back to the sport. Hockey's unique because it is one piece molded plastic boot with an eighth of an inch blade on ice, and there's all kinds of things that can go wrong with that. So I can't say that there's a specific, well, today we're going to do A, B, C. We can have two players with a high ankle sprain, and both will react completely differently. One may stay in what I have as a phase one for a week, The other one may be there for 2 weeks, but it's the identical injury. So I have to read the player and understand what's going on in their minds. Talk to them, get some feedback. For example, I had another kid who had broken ankle with surgery, pins, and internal bracing, and he couldn't turn to the left on day one that we started. So I had to actually scrap what I had planned, and then develop the process more for him individually as we went. I'll leave it at that.
No, that was great. So what I'm getting from that is that there is this is not a cookie cutter model. And in actual fact, what's happening is you, using your experience and your observation and some metrics which are meaningful to you, you're looking at the inefficiencies that the individual has, whether they're biological, pain-driven, psychological, or pain avoidance, and you're creating a progressive program with milestones based on how that individual reacts on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
And what I think that's useful to know is that there's an idea that there's a mold that people fit into. Like if I get we'll talk about high ankle sprain since you referenced it, but if I get that, then I'm going to get some ultrasound, get some modality on it, and then I'm going to progress to the rocker board, and then all of a sudden I'm released to then go back, but no real consideration is being paid to the actual specific demands of the sport and the peculiarities of hockey, which, as you said, are extremely unique.
Right.
And that deep understanding of what a hockey player needs to be able to do, or a skater needs to be able to do, is not replicated well in traditional rehab. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, I've watched some podcasts recently, some very educated people talking about a hockey injury. And the consensus is right now that we cannot, and I've said it for years, we cannot replicate what we do off ice, on ice, or vice versa. So whatever you do for rehab off ice, we can't replicate the demands off ice that we perform on ice. And just along those lines, I mentioned to you offline there in our emails that I'm not a medical professional. Again, I'm a skating coach. So for me, there's two very distinct lines here. One is rehab and one is recovery. For me, rehab is the restoration, primary focus is the restoration of health. And for me, on the recovery side, the primary focus is the restoration of function. So you could be very healthy and feel perfect, but you're still not going to function properly because we've got things to work through in the equipment on ice with the different kind of loading. We just can't replicate the demands of the sport off ice properly. And so it's very important in closing that gap to make sure that when we get them on ice that they can, that we work progressively in a scaled manner to reintroduce the injury. Not just the injury, we work symmetrically. Everything's done on the other side as well, because we want to avoid any compensatory injury as well. The body, as you know, will compensate consciously or unconsciously when something isn't right. And so we don't want to turn an ankle injury into a hip injury or vice versa. So you have to be very aware of what we're doing and progressively work through it, make sure that the athlete is completely on board.
John, you've referenced a couple of times, or I have as well, the demands of the sport. So from your perspective, what are the demands of the sport that would satisfy you that somebody's in a place where they can return back to, say, non-competitive game versus going back to full contact practice versus being available for selection?
A lot of the time, it's going to depend on what the athlete tells you, coupled with what you're seeing on the ice. So if you're performing, say, C cuts, and on the left side is perfect, and on the right side is stunted, or there's a problem, say, going back to say, I did a player recently with surgery on a hip labrum. So once that happened, we got her back on ice, and you could definitely see that there was limited movement. Now, whether that was a conscious, unconscious protection of the injury, or whether there was a physical limitation, when I asked the player, how are you feeling? They're saying, well, it feels tight. Okay, we will continue down this path and we'll work it out. And generally, it does get worked out. As far as the demands, our loading is, ideally from the skating perspective, ideally we want to see a 90-degree knee bend on the support leg while the stride leg is extending out and flexing out to a 45 degree. That's just the loading. Does that happen all the time? No, rarely. A great player to watch for that is Taylor Hall from the Boston Bruins right now. He's got a great load, very low to the ground. Conversely, we can have a player that is a wide track skater who's, when they stride to the outside, they never get close to returning to midline. And that's okay. You just have to be very athletic to be a wide track skater, because you have to have increased frequency. You're not pushing as much ice, so you're going a little quicker. But some of the things that can reach up and bite us from an ice perspective is the acceleration and deceleration. It's very sudden in hockey, especially the decel. And just catching an edge can be an issue. So the demands are extremely high. I just wrote an article for it's a hockey specific site called the Coaches Site that they just published, where I said that recovery of hockey injuries must be hyper specific. The demands of our sport are hyper specific because of the venue, because of the equipment, because of the contact. Therefore, we have to counter that with the hyper specificity of recovering the injury sport specifically. So the demands are high, and it doesn't matter if you're playing like your kids are playing, or if you're playing for the Dallas Stars. The demands are basically the same, just on a different force application.
My next question, since it sounds like you really work with a variety of different injuries with skaters at different levels, what would be the most common or most frequently occurring injuries that you're typically asked to deal with?
Majority of the injuries that I deal with are from lower back down. So we're talking about lower body injuries, sprained ankles. You take a slap shot off the foot, you could have a broken foot. Groin issues, hip flexor issues, back issues, hip issues. Hips and goalies is turning out to be quite a subject of study these days. It's interesting. I watch goalies stretch, and they're amazing. Basically, when they stretch, you can watch them stretch, and but there's something called hypermobility that I, from my perspective, I have to be concerned about, and that is that if your joint is big because you have hypermobility, you're stretching that joint only makes it bigger, which opens you up to injury. So could we maybe shift and look at having goalies do something else other than that stretch? Sure, get a warm up in, but could we do something to help them strengthen those joints? But like I said, hockey's antiquated, and it's a hard sell. It's a hard sell to get the changes. But going back to your question, lower back, hips, hamstrings, quads, knees, ACL, MCL, ankles, feet. That's the majority of my work. Upper body, I have done some upper body. I've done some shoulder labrums. And the idea should be to load as much as you can on the front end of a return to play, so that we don't turn that shoulder injury into a knee injury. So we want to make sure that we're getting them back. The focus should be on those first initial days when they're back, to look after what we need to look after in the long run for player development and for them to continue to play.
What age group are you typically working with here, John? Are you seeing a higher incidence of injuries in younger skaters now? And you said you've been doing this almost over 15 years, but has that demographic or pattern changed somewhat?
No, not really. I've worked with kids as young as 10 years old with had a knee issue, right up to working with college players and pros. So you can't, from a injury severity perspective, I had a 14-year-old kid that had a spiral fracture tib fib. So that's a 14-year-old with spiral fractures. The junior player with the broken ankle, MCL college, ACL college level. It all, because of the contact issue part of our game, that gives rise to injuries. Not being prepared gives rise to injuries. I say that conditioning away from the rink before you step on the ice, your stretching, your flexibility, those kinds of things. Hip labrums. She just crashed into the net awkwardly and hip labrum. Next thing you know, she's having surgery. So male, female, young guys right up to the pros. It is what it is. It's a high contact, high speed game, and the injuries happen.
In terms of recurrence of these injuries, John, so I think this is where you really probably earn your money. It's, because things happen, especially contact injuries, and largely we were talking before that prevention is the wrong word to use, because there's no way of really being able to predict an injury is going to occur or when it's going to occur. What we can do is try to minimize the risks involved in that happening, recognizing that if somebody runs into a net or hits the boards, there's going to be a force there and the body has to absorb that, and that's just kind of how it goes. But what would you look at as what would you want to see change, maybe is a better question, in terms of the recurrence of injury? Where are things going wrong when people are getting injured and then returning and then experiencing a similar injury? Because we know that adage, which is the biggest predictor for a future injury, is history of injury in that same spot, and that probably still bears true for the most part, I would say.
Yeah, from top to bottom, it doesn't matter what the sport is. You could be standing on the sidelines as a soccer game and you'll hear somebody say, that kid has never been the same since he got hurt. And so from the hockey perspective, because there's all kinds of things, even psychologically, that we have to be aware of. The player, especially at the elite level, so if you're playing midget AAA or bantam AAA or any of those elite levels, college, pro, there's a tendency for them to possibly lose their identity. They're hockey players, and all of a sudden now they're not on the bus, and they're not in the room, and they're not having the fun with everything else that's going on. So psychologically, we have to be aware that those impact the recovery process as well. Where I'm going with this is because there's pressure on themselves to get back, because they feel pressure from their peers to return to the game, because they feel there's opportunity to lose a roster spot. Even at the pro level, I'm out for an extended period of time. What's my trade value? What does my contract look like? All those kinds of things come into play. So where I was going is that there's a tendency to rush back. We need to control that, especially from the minor hockey perspective. And the advice that I would give parents is make sure you get involved and make sure you're interested in your kid's injury. Because they shouldn't be rushed back if they're not ready. Where we get the recurrence is when they're not ready and they come back. And then concussion is a whole different ball of wax. So you have to be really ready to come back. And that's kind of what I do. I get them ready to come back. I reintroduce the injury to everything that's going to happen, and we progress that way. Ideally, what should happen, and at minor hockey, you're lucky to have an athletic therapist. At the elite levels in Canada, the AAAs and the AAs, into junior college, of course, you've got an athletic therapist that's part of your team. And they can help with your injury and those kinds of things. Minor hockey generally has a dad that's a coach that's volunteered to coach. And a player will get injured and they'll go away and then they'll come back. And they don't even ask how are you? You've been medically cleared to come back. And now you're back. And you just jump into the fray, and that's where the phrase comes in. He doesn't look right. That's probably, if things don't look right, they probably aren't right from an injury perspective. Hockey's a strange game, especially from you got the parents. They want their kids all to play in the NHL, and you have to be careful about bringing them back too early. So for me, recurrence is because of that. I think they're just back too early. They haven't had a chance to bring the injury back sport specifically, and as a result, they get injured again.
Then, developing on that idea, and you are being very clear about the fact that you have a very specific role in this process, and there are other specialists that play other important roles in, first of all, the identification, I assume, the diagnosis of the injury, all the way through to the individual getting the green light from all of the performance staff. What does that team of professionals look like to you? So let's say we've got an athlete, they've been injured on the ice, there's a therapist, an athletic therapist present, they've been cleared for any emergency stuff. What does it look like then from day one in the therapy room or the training room back through? Who's involved? Where do you start to step in with the ice work? How are those types of decisions made?
Again, that is generally happens at the elite level. It doesn't happen at the minor hockey level. I get calls from parents from the minor hockey level saying, this is what's happened. Can you do something? And generally, of course, we can usually do something. But here's how I would ideally like to see it happen. And it's not happening like I think it could. So the injury happens. They seek medical attention. And then the doctor says, okay, you're not going to return to sport, but you can go back to your athletic therapist. I guess what I'll do is I'll talk from the elite level, and that gives us an idea of, you go back to your athletic therapist. So the athletic therapist, the physical therapist, the massage therapist, the chiropractor are all at that level. So whatever has to happen medically from these people, they do. Once that they say, congratulations, you can now return to sport. Not to play, but you can return to sport. That's where I would step in. So I take the player through the functionality of back on ice. And once we get to, and I've got 3 phases that I use, and once we start transitioning into phase 3, which is the upper level of loading and speed and accel, decel, I would engage a skills coach. So if the team has a skills coach, then the skills coach comes out. I would have them engage with us in phase 3. And then at some point, I'm going to say, congratulations, you're good to go. Back with the skills coach, where he will take them to competitive pace with skating, shooting, stick handling, some small area battles, those kinds of things to prepare them for the game. And then from there, they return to play. That's ideally what I would like to see happen. Unfortunately, even at the midget AAA level here in Lethbridge, it goes from injury to the athletic therapy people or to the medical people, right down to return to play. So there's 2 steps that are missed. And I don't believe, in the conversations that I've had with some pro teams and some ex-players, that what I do is happening at the pro level with any consistency either. So we see it I have a couple of examples I'm not going to say because that'll identify the team, but I don't. I think that some players have been mishandled, and when you see on YouTube, this won't identify anybody, but if you see on YouTube or on Instagram, all of a sudden injured players out skating by themselves and shooting pucks, and they're not in gear, and you're missing such a wide opportunity to provide guidance and to reintroduce that injury, to recondition, to recover the injury properly so that they can begin the process of moving on. We're just missing, the gap is still there. I'm trying to close the gap every day.
Yeah, I like that concept. It was clear to me when we spoke where an individual like you fits into that return to competitive play in that continuum. So I look at it personally as a continuum which blends as you move away from more weight room or training room based stuff back to more sports specific stuff, back to introducing a more chaotic environment where the head must be up, you must be making fast decisions, and you have to be able to rely on your dexterity in order to perform at the level you are, and also to avoid future injury, because if you're slow and sluggish, it's far more likelihood that you're going to be hit again or just not be effective. And then what I'd lead on to that, because we're talking about somebody that's missing practice, missing game time because of an injury, but the reality is we have a lot of chronically injured individuals who are playing through or working through pain, and I assume that in an ideal world we'll say, well, let's shut them down for a little bit and let's get them right. That doesn't really happen. So is there a halfway house for that, John, in your opinion?
Well, that's a tough question. I don't think there is. There's so much pressure, and again, I'm referencing hockey only. There's so much pressure to get back quickly from parents, from peers, from the team. The steps just get missed. Sorry. I've tried. I've approached athletic therapists here in town. I mean, I've done some work with the juniors here with the Lethbridge Hurricanes, but that's few and far between. I look at their injury update regularly and see that there's lots of work that could be done, and I'm not sure what's happening. And again, I'm not saying I'm anything special, but I don't know if there's anybody else. Nobody else has come forward to say I'm doing that as well. I'm going on ice to recover injury. I've had ex-players tell me, geez, I wish that existed when I was playing. I've had ex-players tell me I might still be playing if I'd had opportunity to do this. And yet when you try to talk to teams, there's so much emphasis right now on putting wearable technology on the players and sitting in front of a laptop like a lab rat and watching the blips and the dips of what's happening with them and then making your assessment. Hockey's a people business. You got to get out and talk to the player. How do you feel? Well, it feels really tight. Okay, does it feel really tight like it's not going to improve, or does it? No, it's getting better. Okay, now we can progress. Players not only want to know they're getting better, they need to know they're getting better. I don't know if I said that earlier or not, but there's the psychological aspect is huge. 95% of what I do on your first 2 to 3 meetings is protect the player from himself. They've been away from the ice for a long time, and now they just want to jump back in and get going. Well, we have a scaled process here that is going to work for us just fine if we follow it. So to answer your question, I don't know is there a halfway? I can't see it from my perspective just now.
And I asked that for obvious reasons, that we just know there's so many players playing with injuries. Now I understand from a professional level they're being very well compensated in a lot of people, maybe not in the junior leagues, but they're being compensated at least to be available. For the developmental athlete, at what point, and I know it's difficult for us to make these decisions, but at what point would you be sitting down with a parent saying, it's time for you to consider your athlete takes a break to get this sorted out?
For me, hopefully it'd be the medical step too. The medical people might say, have that meeting with the parent to say things aren't really progressing here. If the medical people grant permission to return to sport, then I get involved, and things just will not improve. I'm going to first refer back to the medical people and sit and hopefully have a talk and say that this is where we're falling back on the ice. We can't seem to progress past. Can you look medically maybe? And if that doesn't happen, then I've never had a parent come to me and ask me that question, but I would be honest with them to say, maybe this isn't. I mean, you have to look at long term here. People don't have to play hockey, so it's up to you. I mean, it's up to you and your son or daughter, but you have to weigh the ability to walk properly when you're 45 as opposed to skate when you're 14, kind of thing. I haven't had that situation, but I would have a frank conversation with them based on what I see. And again, I don't touch it. I don't do any assessments. That player is cleared to return to sport when I deal with them, and that means that they're going on the ice regardless of whether I'm there or not. 99% of the time in minor hockey or developmental players, there's no athletic therapist standing at the side, the side of the rink watching him go back out for the first time to see what's going on. It just doesn't happen. It does at the pros. Other than that, I guess that conversation would have to, but I think you'd have to be delicate.
Very delicate. I've sort of set myself up there for the next piece is a concussion piece, because it's an unseen injury, and I think the difference between a concussive injury versus and let's be honest, a minor traumatic brain injury. There's no such thing really as a concussion. We just call it that to make it more palatable, I think, than call it what it really is. But for sure, there are skaters skating around with that have not fully recovered from concussive work or the incidence of a concussion. I beg your pardon. Is that a group of individuals you also work with post-hand injury and return to sport? And if so, are there any particular considerations that change the category or change that a little bit for you?
Yeah, I have worked with a couple of concussed players. I took a concussion management course just so I could have a better idea of what I should be and shouldn't be doing. Again, they're medically cleared. Somebody has said to them, you can go back. So what I did is I developed its own separate 3 phases for concussion. And it's, for example, in phase 1, it's very soft, and we're skating in straight lines, and we're not doing much tracking with our eyes. Right up to like phase 3, where we're doing tight turns, and I've actually got what I call concussion pucks. So I just took a dozen pucks and I spray painted numbers on one side and letters on the other. And all I want the player to do is they're skating around and I'm passing them pucks. They don't need to call it out, but they got to track it with their eyes so they know whether it's a number or a letter. And so it's just those kinds of things. Things to be considered. I mean, things you have to consider with concussion is the glare off the ice. How bright are the lights coming down on the ice? That could be an issue. How does the player react to pucks banging off the boards and off the glass? Something to consider. How do they do in a crowd? Something to consider. So I think that concussion is very important to do recovery with, progress them through it, and then hand them to the skills coach. I can't make it clear enough, though, that I'm always talking to the player, and at some point, if they were to say, I've got a headache, we stop and they go back to the medical people. I'm in no position to be assessing, well, you're going to be okay. Absolutely not. It's a TBI, and you've got to go back. Once they clear you, we'll start again. But it's too important.
I really respect that integration of the cognitive piece, as well as the multi-sensory piece. I mean, for us, we work with a reasonable amount of concussed patients. athletes, sometimes ex-service men, or people who are individuals who've been injured in line of duty, and you're always adding layers into your process to make it more and more complex and more cognitively demanding up to a point. And clearly there's no replication for the actual game because it's almost impossible to replicate that level of intensity, but you get them as close as you can.
Yeah, there was an article that I read a couple of years ago through the British Journal of Sports Medicine that talked about the incidence of lower body injury associated to concussion. And I think that comes from balance, stability, those elements that are required for our game. That if they're not there, we open ourselves up to knee injuries, to ankle injuries, to running into other players or the contact element. So if cognitively you're not ready to play the game at speed, and it's a fast game, accidents happen whether there's hitting or not. You're opening yourself up for a world of hurt if it doesn't come together for you. Again, skills coaches would be very important there. Yeah, so when dealing with a concussion, if there's an athletic therapist involved with the team that's full-time with the team, that player has to report to the AT first and then answer those questions because it'll be the AT that's done the baseline testing, not myself. So they have to have that conversation with the AT. If they check all the boxes, then we'll go out on ice. But if they don't, then we're back to day one.
So, John, to tie things up, you're based out of Canada. Do you offer consultancy virtually, or is it all in person on the ground where you're at?
It's tough to do it virtually. I've tried it. It's tough to do it virtually because of the subjectivity of the player, where they're at, and to make those subtle changes on ice if something's not going right. I wouldn't want to have something go wrong and that player continue to travel down that because he's just got a recording of something. From the consultancy side, I'm able to travel the world now, so I can, if people are looking for this, if teams are looking for this, I'm more than open to having that conversation and getting out there and dealing with those injured players.
And if that's not an option, but people are looking for something similar to what you do, and I know you're very few and far between, but what would be the closest equivalent, in your opinion, to the type of work that you're doing?
I would suggest finding yourself a good strength and conditioning program and having that conversation with the S&C and see what they come up with. Hockey's unique because we need the rink, and so it's also expensive. So to rent ice for a half hour in wherever in Dallas could be $250 for a half hour. That's expensive. So find and talk to your AC or your physical therapist and see what they can come up with. There's a guy in Calgary. His name is Doug Crashley. He runs Crash Conditioning, a highly touted premier strength and conditioning program for hockey. Doug does a lot of work with the off-ice side, but he's also developed an on-ice program. So he may have some resources. He'd be an excellent contact. He's got a website, Crash Conditioning. I'm sure there's a contact drop down there for him. He'd be a really good person to speak to.
John, thank you so much for sharing with us your experiences and your knowledge and your expertise on a very specific area. And really, truly, there's very few people that I've encountered in my years who are doing what you're doing and do it with the passion that you do it with as well. There's obviously you really care and value what you do and the service you're providing to athletes as well.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, to take a player that going back to that kid with the pins and surgery. I mean, on day one, he hurt himself. He's playing junior in Fort McMurray, Alberta, for the Alberta Junior Hockey League. And on day one, he's got tears in his eyes. I mean, he's 18 years old, and he says, "I'll never play again." I said, "Just come with me on this journey, and let's see where we go." And he ended up playing 4 years NCAA at Lindenwood, so just finished his career. So great success story, and a lot of good things can happen if we treat the injury properly and just don't throw them back to